Hello, everybody, and welcome to In the Studio, the very first episode of Season 1. Today, I am going to talk to you about a couple pieces of music I wrote for the upcoming horror game 10 Dead Doves. There are two separate cues in this piece. The first cue is titled Something's Up, and the second, Run Like Hell. For those of you who have played the free demo of 10 Dead Doves, you may recognize this music. Both cues are heard near the end of the demo when the player character Mark Stetson and his friend Sean Russell go back to the gas station after Sean's car runs out of gas. Now, before I get hip deep in these cues, I want to say that almost every instrument in here is a virtual instrument, with a few exceptions. This game doesn't have the budget to hire a live orchestra, so I'm mostly using sample libraries. Okay, I'm going to play the cue, something's up, then I'm going to dive into it. Here we go. All right, so first things first. Something's Up was one of the first pieces I wrote for 10 Dead Doves. As you may have guessed, this piece is meant to loop. For those of you who don't know what that means, in video games you will often hear a piece of music that was written for a specific area or situation. This piece will loop, meaning it will play over and over and over for however long the player is in that area. During a weekly meeting with the developers, Sean and Mark, no relation to the in game characters, by the way, Sean asked me to include a couple sounds that he made in this piece. The first being this. And the second being this. As I recall, I started with these hits. Obviously, it's quite percussive, so I decided to double it with some very, very soft bass drums. Now, this bass drum is coming from Spitfire Audio's Hammers, which they made in collaboration with Charlie Clouser, who is the composer for the Saw movies. I got this library because I knew I would need something tight and focused for action scenes, and this library fills that role very, very well. I use this library and I am continuing to use this library throughout the entire score for 10 Dead Doves. Now, after settling on a general structure for this cue, I thought there's a tone in these two sounds. I thought, what tone is that? What note is that? Turns out it is a low B flat. So I went to Spitfire Audio's Albion 1 and I laid down a quick bass line. Now the basses float between this B flat and a half step above that, B natural or C flat, whichever one you want to call it. And this minor second, this half step relationship, is a recurring idea that you'll hear throughout the entire score for the game. So, as it is, this piece doesn't move much. It floats between these two notes and doesn't really go anywhere. So, I felt it needed some kind of motion. This is not an action cue, so it didn't need to move a whole lot. It just needed to feel creepy and like something was off about the situation, hence the name. So I added a simple piano line from Heaviosity's Ascend Modern Grand Piano. Admittedly, not my favorite piano plugin, but some of the presets are pretty cool. Now, another thing about the horror genre in general is ambience. Many modern horror films and games use ambience to really set the tone for what it is that they're doing. These are not sounds that you're necessarily conscious of. I've heard this ambience referred to as infrasound, which is supposed to be below the range of human hearing. So, if that's the case, you feel it rather than hear it. I knew I would need ambience for the tense moments of this game, so I went to Thrill by Native Instruments. Very unsettling sound. Really, really sets the tone for this scene very, very nicely. You will notice I have the actual instrument track disabled. Reason being is because at the time of writing this, almost 2 years ago, the computer I was working on at that time had maybe 16 gigabytes of RAM. So, suffice to say, that day it was chugging to work with all of these instrument tracks. So, I simply rendered this track out to audio and it helped free up resources. But this is what this sound sounds like. Very creepy, very cool, love it. Now, as you no doubt heard, the cue does change ever so slightly over time. It gets a bit more intense as the player continues in and around the gas station, so I added a loop from Hammers to help give it a bit more motion. I also added a big bassy hit and a gong sound from Heaviosity's Damage 2. And to help things along, I added Spitfire's Albion Uist. They call this particular patch Intense Chromatic Chatter. All right, next up, Run Like Hell. No spoilers, but let's just say there's a reason why this cue is so intense. Okay, we'll get to this a little bit later. I want to focus on this first part first. Now, as you can note out here, this part is a continuation of the material from Something's Up to give both cues a sense of continuity. I remember when I was working on this cue, I found a video on Spitfire Audio's YouTube channel specifically talking about writing for percussion. I'll link it down below for those of you who want to see it. Christian Henson presents some very helpful tips for percussion writing. I won't go too in depth about the specifics in this video, but the main ideas I took away are: 1. Don't leather it. The idea here is that percussion will become unimpactful very, very quickly by just cranking it out. So great care should be taken when voicing percussion. Number 2, as Henson says, light and shade. It's this idea of contrasting dynamics. The loud stuff will be impactful and in your face if it's next to something quiet. So rather than writing the percussion to go all out all the time, I wrote it so that it almost comes in waves. It's still intense and still has that drive of an action scene, but it plays with dynamics and what instruments are playing and when. Let's listen to the percussion soloed. And again, we'll get to this section here in just a moment. I also remembered another video I had seen of Jason Graves, composer for Until Dawn and Dead Space, also talking about percussion, which I will link down below. He briefly talks about using loops in his writing and more specifically how he uses them. So I took a few pointers from him and purposefully changed what loops were playing and when for certain scenes. In this case, the frame drums handle the majority of the work. Fun fact about this library, not only do you have the various instruments and playing styles, but you also have reverse hits and what they call warps, which are loops that have been mangled and processed to sound completely different from the original sample. And again, using this idea of changing loops, more specifically, changing loops during little transition phrases. And also the reverses, more specifically, the bass drums and the rototom reverses. As you can imagine, these are excellent for transition phrases. Here I added the surdos just to help give it a little more power. Now, the string parts for this particular cue are not too different from the previous versions, but I did add some more texture to this part using Albion Uist. And all of this, which is a loopable piece of music, flows right into the score for the cutscene where Sean and Mark have to hop a fence. I first started with the strings, more specifically these spiccato and collegnos in the cellos and basses. Then I added the textural elements on top to help up the intensity and the terror of what is happening in this scene. And the percussion carries over similar ideas to what I had been working with before, but as you will notice, a bit less. There's dialogue in this scene, and I did not want the percussion to step all over it, so I dialed back the percussion just a smidge, and I really let these frame drum loops carry this particular part with the low percussion reinforcing the string parts. Also added a sub hit from Damage 2 at the very end for that final hit. Me personally, I am a huge fan of low brass and low strings doubling each other, so I did just that. I also went back to Albion Uist for some very atonal brass and string phrases and stabs to help build up to the climax even more and to really hit home with that final sub hit. Here's the brass by itself. And now, brass and strings. All right, so now that you've heard both sections individually, I'm going to play this cue start to finish. Here we go. All right, and for those of you who are attentive, you'll notice that this ambient track is disabled. Reason being is because I rendered this out as audio here, and I left it, and I edited it so that Mark could throw it in and use it wherever he wanted, and thus make the ambience its own separate thing. And there you have it. I hope you all enjoyed this episode, and I will see you in the next one.